Today, we're treated to a master class on diplomacy, statesmanship, and volunteerism, all from a cook's perspective, courtesy of Chef Jose Andres.
Hi, and welcome to Yeti at Large. This is a channel focused on making the most out of what you have, no matter where you're at. Thanks for tuning in and helping out.
Thank you so much for joining us today on Yeti at Large. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with a friend. I woke up this morning treated to a video from one of my favorite channels from World's Central Kitchen and Chef Jose Andres. If you don't know these people's mission or subscribe to their channel, there's a link below in the comments. Please go to them, subscribe them, and consider supporting their mission of feeding people. I'm a donor and a volunteer seeking to do more to help these people. In this morning's video, we were treated to a master class and a perfect example of diplomacy, statesmanship, and volunteerism. Now, the purpose of this example, and why I'm glowing over it a bit, was that Chef Jose isn't a trained public relations or diplomat expert. He's just a guy who feeds people. He's understood the fundamental precept that you can simultaneously and passionately advocate for your position, ask tough questions of the person you're interviewing, the person who is a gatekeeper, or the person who potentially is standing in your way to acquiring more resources for your organization. In this case, I don't think the Secretary of State is, but you can do all of that without humiliating or insulting that person, that opponent, that gatekeeper. And that is the essence of diplomacy. I know that Chef feels very strongly about feeding people. This is a guy a few years ago who saw a need, packed a backpack, and went to the front lines of where there was a need to feed hungry people. And I believe the story goes that he was roughly asked, "What do you do?" And he just stated, "I feed people." And look what's grown from that. An excellent example of volunteerism and community support. Today, Chef was fortunate enough to get the Secretary of State, Anthony J. Blinken, to put some time on his schedule to interview him. Now, we're going to have a little fun with the Secretary here for a minute. Anthony J. Blinken. A. Blinken. Abe Lincoln. Abe Blinken. I'm not the first person to notice that. And it's kind of fun, and it's appropriate for today's video because Abraham Lincoln was also a cook with a blue apron, and he was a good cook. He helped raise many of his siblings when he was very young, and he was famous for coming home from Senate, putting on his blue apron and helping Mary in the kitchen. One of my favorite Lincoln quotes of all time talks about those who give freely, give without purpose of reward, and give without thinking of their own needs first. He was being heaped praise by a certain politician, and he'd grown tired of it. And he told this individual that there's nobody who loves gingerbread more than I, and nobody who gets less of it than I. The point to that quote, what it means to me today, is that Abraham Lincoln received much and gave freely, and gave to other people before his own needs were met. I think that's an excellent example. One of the things I did want to point out is the Secretary of State, as you can see, is wearing one of these pins that you've seen many times. Same pin I have here. This is a pin from the Secret Service. This was given to me directly by a Secret Service agent. Where I was geographically located and involved in public safety, I've been involved in dignitary visits from time to time. Obviously, the Grand Canyon is a huge magnet, and we're long overdue for a presidential visit. But that being said, on one of those dignitary visits, I was fortunate enough to work with a great agent who represented the agency well and the people he served like a true professional, and he gave me this pin. This interview was done very well, and it focused on food security as a principal position of a government for larger issues, and it delved into topics of aid, support, infrastructure, and those kinds of things. And now I'm never going to blame a diplomat, the secretary here, a politician, an administrator, for going right to the talking points. They're proven, they're safe, and I understand why they do it. But Jose did a great job of staying focused on the specific mission of feeding hungry people and how that happens. And they talked about some of the unforeseen consequences, which I want to talk about today as well. The secretary made a comment, a quote, if you will, and it was so profound that I was certain it had historical roots. The secretary early on discussing how we come to the end of the conflict in Ukraine, which the premise was it's gone on much longer than anybody anticipated or hoped. Obviously, we want these things to come to a safe and speedy end. But the Secretary said, and I quote, "on just and durable terms." Now that's a timeless statesman quote. On just and durable terms. It needs to be lawful. There needs to be justice involved in that. And durable. It needs to last. It needs to be ironclad. It needs to have teeth and consequences for violations of those terms. On just and durable terms. I was impressed not to find that exact quote anywhere in history. The closest I came was the 1943 Council of American Churches of Christ, and they had put out some political position papers, and their exact quote was "a just and lasting peace." And they were talking about navigating the Cold War and the United States' obligation to the world community. So I think that was interesting because defining just and durable terms, it's vague, it's specifically vague. I've talked about that in previous communication videos we've done on our channel, but it's ironclad in the point the terms have been set. It's very impressive that the Secretary made time to do this interview in such a contentious time where words could be easily twisted or misused, and that's that law of unintended consequences. You go out meaning to say something and well-meaning about it, but it winds up being used in a different way and causing damage, and we're going to talk about that with USAID. At the end of the interview, I'm going to skip around a bit. The chef made a comment and a quote. He's a historical reader. He loves history and food-related history, and he talked about Nicholas Appert. I wrote his name down to make sure I got it right. And I know this man, Nicholas Appert. He was a French guy, confectioner, and a brewer. He made good beer. I've studied him in the past because he's widely regarded as the inventor of canning, food preservation. He came to learn quickly, long before Louis Pasteur understood microorganisms and sanitation, that by cooking food in a sealed container, it remained preserved provided the seals on that container didn't leak. Interestingly enough, this was about the time of the Napoleonic Wars, and Napoleon, they shrunk his exact statement down, and he's been widely misquoted on this, but the sentiment was an army travels on its stomach. And that goes a lot with what Norman Schwarzkopf talked about in the original Desert Shield and Desert Storm, that he who gets there with the most first typically wins. So interesting that the man who invented modern canning and food preservation and feeding people absolutely revolutionized naval excursions, naval warfare. And it's another thing near and dear to our heart because our preparation series talks about preparing like a cook on a ship. We have several of those on our channel too. We don't prepare for the zombie apocalypse. We prepare just for extended periods of supply chain interruption. And that's exactly what Chef Andres does. He would tell you the root of food security begins with a well-stocked pantry and ability to acquire clean water to feed the people in your home and next door. Interestingly enough, Nicholas Appert's invention wasn't widely accepted by the French Science Academy, and he ended up selling it to the British, who used it extensively in their naval operations and to great advantage over their opponents during times of warfare. What struck me the most from my own personal experiences was they talked a lot about United States food aid and world food aid. But back in the 80s, we remember hearing the first reports of food aid, and these huge bags of grains and rice and beans and all types of materials were shipped all over the country. Sub-Sahara Africa, Ethiopia was a big one, the Middle East, parts of Asia received this food aid. And the law of unintended consequences really came into play when we first learned that these giant bags emblazoned with a huge U.S. flag on them became a target. Because that flag was on that bag of food, it became a target and it created conflict. Never saw that coming. And people who saw that aid come in saw it as an extension of the principles and the positions in their opponent, sought to destroy that aid. And it happened many times. Plus, it created a fight over people who were ill prepared to fight. They were there to prepare the food to feed people, suddenly got caught in the middle of a conflict with people trying to steal that aid. And oftentimes, we've seen too many examples of that aid winding up in the hands of the groups that we sought to take out of power. So now we're providing aid and comfort to the enemy, in a sense, in a term. And I'm not making any wide-sweeping political judgments. Matter of fact, I had a cook one time who was from Libya, and he told me stories about his father in North Africa in the 40s, and they had set up a mess hall, a galley, a feeding facility. And the interesting thing was where that galley and that facility was traded hands several times during the conflict and was occupied many times by Axis powers, Allied powers, tribal entities, warlords throughout the conflict. They kept feeding because they were unarmed and they flew the correct flags to indicate to anybody that they kept feeding people through this change of authority. Nobody stopped them or destroyed the facility because, again, an army travels on its stomach. And I've never found an official record of this, and I'm not surprised I haven't. But the point of his story was he had said that at one point somebody reoccupied the camp and wanted the guy in charge brought up on charges for providing aid and comfort to the enemy. The guy in charge had said, I will not lie, I've provided aid and comfort, but my enemy is hunger. My enemy doesn't have a flag. And I'm so touched by that I wished I could find concrete examples of that story. If you have any information on that or can lead me to a documentation of that, please reach out to me. I would love to do an in-depth special on that story. My enemy is hunger. So here we have U.S. aid destroyed because of the symbolism emblazoned on the aid packaging or falling into the hands of the people that are causing the most harm. It has long been my position and premise that the boxes and the bags the aid is delivered in should be multilingual, labeled with exactly what they are, and cooking instructions on how to best prepare it for maximum nutrition, maximum yield, and the lowest amount of consumed fuel and clean water. And they should be in languages and pictographs. And there should be information on the bag about sanitation. Now, I strongly believe there should be QR codes because there's enough technology out there to go to a website that could show people if they've got service. You never know. It's 2023 at the time I'm recording this. But it should be all about the food, not about the flag. And if you dismiss those symbols of affiliation, you take one more point of potential conflict off the table, and that is the absolute root of diplomacy and statesmanship and volunteerism. The other interesting thing that was brought up that is quite painful to think about is the economic, the socio-economic. And they talked about providing infrastructure, not just giving a man a fish, but teaching the man how to fish. And this is where Chef Jose comes in, and he's just brilliant because he clearly demonstrates this starts at a local issue on the table. You got one guy with a cutting board and a pot, some clean water and some food, and he's feeding people. And it's low overhead, it's direct impact, and that's the lasting change that he seeks to make, because he's not just feeding people. His teams aren't just feeding people when they're there. They're teaching people. They're providing detailed instructions on how sanitation works. They're evaluating facilities and resources, improving them and educating. And so when they do step back, the people can take over the reins of the facility and continue its operation long into the future. When these aid ships and cargo planes show up, a lot of times, and again, the laws of unintended consequences, they flood the market with inexpensive or free materials, grains, rice, beans, meat, dried vegetables, and they destroy the local agriculture economy because where a guy was making a few cents, translate that into the denominations of the area, on a pound or a kilo of an item, now suddenly the market's full of it and it's free, and he's gone bankrupt. And they've destroyed the local industries meaning to do well by providing this food. I'm not saying we don't come in with food fast. The exit strategy needs to be baked into the deployment strategy, the stand down, as we say in FEMA. But whoever thought by delivering all of this food to a stricken area, and there's two kinds of disasters. I can almost lump everything into conflict or natural disaster. You can put almost everything in those two things. After World War II ended, ships showed up in Japan with their cargo holds full of wheat. Japanese people necessarily didn't make a lot of bread then, and so they turned it into noodles. And we now have ramen today in large part because of this and the variety of noodles and the depth of it. It caused some hardship, but these people took lemons and made lemonade. and which, by the way, citrus is one of the best things you can deliver. This was a fantastic treat. I commented right away on it, and I hated trolling putting a link to my audition video, but I very much want to be involved with this chef, and I appreciate the Secretary of State being available for this and discussing this. What Chef Andres has done is move the bar towards a more human, fundamental, basic precept. And what the Secretary echoed, when we see hunger, we see conflict, which is why I maintain a well-stocked pantry in a good community, and I'm prepared to feed hundreds of people a week, combining resources and facilities, take care of a very basic need on a very human level. Thank you so much for joining us. And remember, food is best when it meets you where you need it.